Welcome, bienvenidos, and Maurica to the second communications webinar of our communication series. For those who were unable to attend the first session, it is recorded and will be available via our agency's YouTube channel. Currently, we do have the Spanish version up, and we are making some final edits to the English version, and that will be up shortly as well. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and is interactive. And so please feel free to use the chat feature as well as unmute setting in order to speak in if you prefer to use your voice. We will also have 2 workshopping sessions on September 29th to sort of follow up from these learning sessions. And so if you want an opportunity to practice some of the skills that you have learned over the course of the last 2 workshop sessions, we encourage you to join us on those on September 29th. At the conclusion of the webinar, we will also share a bilingual evaluation survey, which we hope you will fill out to give both FCISV and our presenter for today, Ray Myers, feedback on what you learned, what you wish you can learn in the future, and any suggestions that you have. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Ray Myers, our communications extraordinaire.
Thanks a lot, Eva. I just want to make sure I'm going to share my screen, and I hope can everybody hear me okay? Volume is good and such. Excellent. And now everybody is seeing my screen. Can't see the chat, so okay. Let me get my stuff situated real quick. Okay.
Yes, and we can see the screen and we can hear you.
Awesome. Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to spend the next 2 hours talking about social and digital storytelling and how we can use that as an effective tool in work as a sexual violence advocate. My name is Ray Myers. I identify as genderqueer and non-binary and use they, them pronouns. I'm a digital advocacy and communication specialist. I've been working within a variety of fields for about the last decade, mostly focusing on healthcare and LGBTQ issues. I've been doing that work in a capacity around influencing legislation and law, supporting organizing and advocacy staff, working with grassroots organizations. I've done some political campaigns, and I have even started off doing this work, working with small businesses. To put today in context, I want to begin with this quote that I really love from Ursula K. Le Guin, who is a science fiction writer from the 60s to the 80s, who is pretty well known for creating in-depth and compelling worlds with a variety of social and interpersonal dynamics that are very different from what we're used to. And in this quote, she says, excuse me, sorry. I have bad seasonal allergies right now, so I'll try my best not to die or asphyxiate on screen. But in this quote, she says, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." The first part of that quote is really popular, but rarely do you see where she goes on and says, "Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often our art, the art of the written word."
Las palabras. Excuse me, this is the interpreter.
Yes.
I was able to interpret everything, but a loving reminder to please pace yourself when you are reading something. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, thank you. So yes, so that is, that I think very much encapsulates what we're going to be talking about. And that's how do we storytell in a way that is compelling and the way that can actually make changes in our world and in our communities that are in line with the work we're doing as sexual SV advocates. So what is storytelling? As a level set for all of us that are here, storytelling is broadly any activity or creation that shares elements of a survivor's experience with a larger audience. This can be written, spoken, painted, danced, or expressed in any other way you can imagine. So when we're talking here, we are not just talking about written stories. We are not just talking about telling a story on a video or in audio. We are also talking about all kinds of expressions of stories or elements of those stories. We're taking a very broad definition here. So who are our storytellers? I'm making this distinction to begin with because I think that this is important for when we think about the work. On one hand, some of our storytellers are victim advocates. Those are those of you on this call, professionals who are advocating for victims, running support groups, helping people through the legal system, and working to advocate and educate around these issues. And then we also have the survivors themselves, which may be interested in doing storytelling or advocacy work as part of their healing of what they've been through. I think that this is important. I think it's important to recognize that there is definitely overlap between these two groups. Many people who become victim advocates have a background and a history of being themselves survivors of abuse or other difficult situations, and to keep that in mind too. So much of what we're going to be focusing on is going to be how do victim advocates help survivors tell their stories? How do victim advocates tell stories themselves? And what are the benefits of centering survivor stories in the work that we do? To begin, I want to take a look at a handful of what I found that I thought were relatively compelling storytelling projects to give you an idea of the scope of what these things can be. The first one, the clothing project, as you see in the pictures here, this was a display that was set up to display the outfits that represent the clothes that were worn during a sexual assault, and each one includes a written story. In this case, it's very compelling because you can tell a lot about looking at a picture of clothing. You can tell a lot about what was going on in the moment. You can tell a lot about who the person was by looking at an outfit or a suitcase or anything else like that. That will convey a lot that would take a long time to write out, would take a long time to really describe in words, that really kind of hits you pretty instantly when you're looking at an outfit. You understand who the person was, you understand the situation that they were in, and maybe even a little bit more about the larger context of what they went through. The shoe project here in Florida was a project where real or paper shoes were decorated and created during support groups and then were put on display at the Capitol. This was a way to help, on one hand, help survivors process and heal, and on another way was a visual and striking representation of the larger context of the challenge and problem of sexual violence put directly in front of decision makers at our Capitol. The Clothesline Project is another one that originates from the Utah Valley University. I actually didn't realize this until I looked this up, because I don't know if it's directly authorized or if people have taken on this project and extended it out beyond the original university. But in this project, each shirt, folks decorate shirts, and each shirt is made by a survivor of violence or by someone who has lost a loved one to violence. They have a whole color coding system that they use, where different colored shirts mean different things. And if you visit their website, they have a pretty extensive gallery that shows this color coding and that shows pictures of all of these different shirts where you can read them, and where you can, you can just read them, you can look at them, you can scroll through them. So they have a strong digital element, which is why I think that this program and this project has been taken on by a number of smaller groups as well. I originally learned about this many years ago attending a Take Back the Night event in Central Florida. And when I was putting together these slides, I was like, oh, I remember this particular program. And it was really compelling in the moment to see these clotheslines of shirts set up with stations where people could make their own and add to the collection. And when I went to research it, I had no idea that it was originally connected to this university. So it's something that, because it was compelling and because it had a strong digital presence, it took off in a lot of other ways. This next one is an entirely digital storytelling program, and it's pretty straightforward compared to some of these others. It is somebody talking about a survivor talking about their experience, and this comes from Just Detention International, which is a group that does work around rape and sexual assault in prison. So we are going to take a minute to watch this. Let's see if this actually plays audio.
There are quite a few different officers that an inmate
Can you all
had
hear
to
that?
check in with.
Yes, we can hear.
And all those people, they all referred to me by my number. That advocate asked me what my name was. Because I'm not a thing.
Ray, we lost the sound because you muted yourself.
Oh, wait,
Joe was one of the first clients I had.
you jumped back a little bit.
I'm a person with a name. And the first thing I told him was, my name's Joe.
Joe was one of the first clients I had, and I was brand new, like sexual assault advocate. Most of my communication with incarcerated survivors was through letters, and I would read, these words, and the feelings that they were expressing weren't all that different than any other survivor that I had worked with. The self-blame, the shame, the fear, the trauma, all of that stuff just was very similar to everyone else that I had worked with. The big difference being that, you know, their resources were so limited, and their ability to self-soothe and their ability to seek out appropriate support was almost nothing.
I went to a psychologist, and my plan is that no matter what, am I going back into that cell? Psych says, okay, we'll get you moved. So I leave the psych, and here come the cops. And he comes up to me, he tells me, he says, all right, let's go. I said, where are we going? He said, back to your cell. Put me in waist chains and put me back in the cell. Nobody would let me out. I was on top of my bed. I was on the top bunk. He grabbed my ankle and he pulled me off the bed and proceeded to rape me. And the second night he raped me. And the third. And the fourth. Getting in contact with Jessica. Saved my life.
Some of the things that I would hear in the letters was just a lot of feeling isolated. And, you know, with survivors who weren't incarcerated, you know, they could just pick up the phone and call. You know, we had a 24-hour crisis line. They could call whenever they, you know, felt like it. But with the incarcerated survivors, you know, their access to that communication was so limited. And so there was something really powerful and like tangible about getting a letter, you know, and you could see how hard they wrote or what their handwriting looked like. And then being able to write back, it was kind of this opportunity to be very thoughtful in a way that I couldn't have been on the phone. Like in an immediate crisis, I was able to really be very thoughtful in my responses.
Jessica was my advocate when I was assaulted. She was the person that I it wasn't my fault. That was a turning point for me. As soon as she told me I knew without a doubt, and she could have never said another word to me. At that point, I knew that I hadn't done this. After this, all I had been treated like a number. She asked for my name and she took my hand as a human being. And it really made a difference. My name is Joe.
So firstly, thank you for Eva for actually suggesting this video and doing a lot of work with me to connect the overarching ideas of storytelling and communications directly into sexual violence work. Now I wanted to ask y'all, and you can either come off mute and speak or you can say it in the chat. But I'm curious what y'all thought was compelling about this story video and the storytelling. Anything that seemed to jump out to you, anything that seemed particularly effective or moving, or even anything you felt didn't hit quite right.
Hi there. My name is Cassandra. I'm a victim advocate here in Alachua County, and I remember seeing this video a couple of years ago at the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence conference, and I just remember crying while watching it. It's just such a powerful component that I think truly captures the emotion that a survivor experiences, but also that lack of power that they have, especially in that incarcerated setting, and recognizing that we as advocates truly have the capacity to help change that person's narrative, you know, just by asking someone what their name is and sending them and letting them know that we believe them and that we're here for them. So I think it just truly hits on all of those markers in a very condensed way without it being too much and without it being not enough.
Absolutely. Let me see. So Kaylin in the comments says, I think the ending where he says his name was very moving and wrapped the whole video up I think the ending where he says his name was very moving and wrapped the whole video up very nicely. I also think having a secondary survivor in the video helped market the video not only to survivors, but also to those who support survivors. Definitely. Does anybody else have any thoughts there? Anything about the video, about elements that were used or the framing that made it particularly effective or moving?
I do. I remember that I've had over the course of time, a lot of survivors, and myself included, who come into work in incarcerated settings with a lot of fear of what it might look like, or yeah, just fears. And you know, this training and that particular video, which was the first video of the series that I watched, really helped to humanize the individuals who are survivors experiencing incarceration for me on a completely different level, I think. And so I think that, you know, I said that earlier in the chat, but one of the most important aspects of communications for sexual assault centers is really just adding that human element, because there are so many things that we hear, so many negative messages we hear from law enforcement, from health, you know, the health industry, about what they think about survivors who come through their systems. And so thinking strategically about how to start changing that narrative through the stories that we tell.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have another comment in the chat. Meg says, Joe's openness above all else, in just a few minutes, it does a really impressive job of highlighting the lack of autonomy and degradation, and then the importance of being seen and heard and supported as a human. Joe's humanity and individual person. So I'm still focusing on how well and how exactly they did that. So moving. And the B-roll definitely helped create context and put us in the scene there to create empathy, to create empathy. Absolutely. Does anybody else have anything that they would like to add?
Yes, I do. I guess the part that touched me the most about it is the picture or graphic of like the jail cell and the little window with bars, and then the sound of the jail door closing. I think that kind of just made it hit more home and maybe like kind of see what the victim or survivor had felt at that moment. So I think that was really touching.
Absolutely. I think that those images reminded me, I can connect back to the clothing project that I went over, and just like, you get that view, that image that like contextualizes the experience as much as something like an open suitcase or a set of like, you know, farm workers clothing. Some other things in this video that I think from a communications direct point of view. Oh, does anybody else have input before I go on and talk about some stuff? I want to make sure everybody has a chance to speak. Right, I think we're good then. What was really compelling from what I thought was really compelling and effective about this video was that they took this concept of my name is Joe and they kept returning to it. They began with talking about the name and being named instead of a number, and being like having somebody see his humanity. And they retouched back on it in the middle of the video, and then at the very end of the video, they wrapped up in the same way they started. And in the middle, they wandered a little bit, but they kept coming back to that point. It was a very effective and simple point. Like, name is humanity, is care, is healing. And wherever else they went, they kept coming back to that. And I think that made for a really compelling storytelling piece. Like, because you're asking people to process some pretty emotional stuff. So by couching it all in such a simple sentiment, you are making it a lot more digestible, and in a lot of ways deep too, because there's all kinds of ways that the individual watching this can connect and kind of integrate this experience they're having told to them with their own experiences, with their own or lack of experience if they've not experienced anything like that, to create that degree of empathy. I also think they did a very good job with the advocate of moving back and forth and lifting up the Joe and Joe's experience while also lifting up the work that Just Detention does in a way that didn't feel like the organization was saying, look at what we're doing, we're so great, but also not burying the actual work that they do. And in fact, also showing that sometimes the work, like sometimes a very simple action of recognizing somebody's humanity can create a huge amount of change, you know, and that you know, it's not necessarily incredibly deep or difficult to do. It is difficult, but it's not exactly complicated, if that comes across.
There are quite a few different officers that an inmate has to.
No, I don't want that.
There are quite a.
That was weird. Okay. That just glitched there. Okay. So we're gonna do some more sharing. There's a lot of chances for discussion in this this is not a podcast, in this workshop. There's a lot of chances for discussion. You know, we're gonna go into our next one. I wanted to give you all an opportunity if you wanted to share other storytelling examples that you've encountered. And if you can either again in the chat or come off mute. And also, I didn't ask, but I appreciate y'all giving your name and telling us like what part of the state you're from and what agency you're with. But tell me about a storytelling example that you've seen, either one that you've done yourself or your agency's done, or you've seen other organizations do. So give a brief idea of what it was. Why was it compelling? Why do you remember it? And if you know if there was a digital component to that, which means was it being shared on social media? Did it have a website, video, podcasts, anything like that? So feel free to chime in.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hi, my name is Meg. My pronouns are she and her. I'm in Southwest Florida at ACT on the community education team. I think, I guess I'll give an example that also is like part of the reason why I'm so excited you're here, Ray, and a little bit of a question. I came from work doing storytelling for a year-long recovery program, and we had so many examples of, I think, great stories, but I feel like what made them great stories was that it was kind of like a before and after picture. So we had one in particular that I remember of a guy named Stan who, real quick short story, the video showed how his kidneys were failing and he was dying in a hospital situation. Then through going through the recovery program and healing, etc., recovered with his addiction, as well as then went on to become like a marathon runner and went to these really special, I'm not really familiar on marathons, but really important marathons that he got invited to and ran in. So there was this great imagery from like the hospital to running marathons. And so I feel like with work at what I do now and what we do here at a rape crisis center and a domestic violence center, you don't always get the chance to have these drastic before and afters that are, you know, a lot more people who are, you know, lingering trauma, and it's not like a pretty picture at the end of it, and doing it appropriately and all those different things. So that was an example that I thought was really compelling, and it was the visuals of it that was really compelling. Yeah.
Absolutely. I have a, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I want to follow up because I think there's something important you said there in talking about the person running a marathon and things like that, and finding those type of stories. Do you think there is worth in stories that don't necessarily wrap up so neatly, stories where people are still struggling, and like do you have feeling of like where there might be a place for that within the work and within storytelling as well?
Yeah, no, great question. I think that's part of my learning curve right now, and I think that's a great way to figure out how to do that. From the fundraising perspective, that's not how I'm trained. It has to be a really good feel-good story at the end. So that is, but I love that you said that, and I think that's a really important groove to find how to do appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's important there too. I think what you just said is, I think there's also the consideration for the story of where, like, what are you trying to do with it? Are you trying to raise money? Are you trying to raise awareness? Are you trying to help other survivors? Roxanne, I see your hand is up.
Hi, Roxanne from the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. I am the LGBTQ+ advocate. I do a lot of the Instagram Reels and the TikToks because I do think that it's a very short way to like combat like victim blaming and make sure to like support survivors and highlight their experiences. But I do think that there needs to be a way for, because the VSC has a speakers bureau where we have survivors that tell their story, and I really want to find a way for to include them in videos if they're comfortable with doing that, so that their specific experiences are really like amplified. And then the VSC and Zebra Coalition are currently working on a video for sexual assault nurse examiners about the experiences of transgender survivors. So I think that storytelling and including the experiences of survivors in there is really important. So yeah.
Absolutely. I love that too. I think that some of these video-based storytelling platforms are really powerful. I have some background doing work with speakers bureaus and other contexts. So it may be, if you're able, hopefully I'm hoping you're able to jump onto one of the workshopping sessions near the end of the month, because we could definitely kind of get more into like kind of the nitty-gritty and ideas of some of that stuff if you're available. But you know, I love that too. Let's see, what do we got in the chat? Jeannie says empty place at the table, which is not digital, and the red ladies, which is not digital. I think I have an idea of what Empty Place at the Table is. I'm not familiar with Red Ladies. Does anybody want to speak to those projects? Maybe in a little bit, like give a little bit more of an idea of what those are. Okay. Shannon says, this is Shannon, Sexual Assault Program Manager at CARE in Charlotte County. I have a good storytelling example in my personal nonprofit with One Human Trafficking Ministry. Kelly Powell tells her story of being a runaway in her youth and how she was targeted by traffickers. The digital component is on lifeactionmissions.com. Okay, so there's a link there. So thank you very much for sharing that, Shannon. I see Cassandra has their hand up.
Hi again, friends. Our project manager, Brittany's on here, and she reminded me we did a Survivors of Violence art exhibit. Our organization, Alachua County Victim Services and Rape Crisis Center, we've been doing that, oh gosh, I would say over a decade. But then, of course, with the pandemic and COVID-19, you know, we had to postpone all of those things. And so this was the first year we did it over 2 years without having one. And so it's a great opportunity. We post flyers, and survivors of any interpersonal violence can submit an application, and they have the opportunity to display art in various mediums. So we've had in the past someone doing dancing, we've had someone doing reading a poem, we've had photographs, we've had 3D art, and we collaborate with local organizations in the community to host it. And this year it was held at the Harn Museum of Art, attached with the University of Florida. And it was just this beautiful space that survivors were able to demonstrate their experience and their journey. And we're very fortunate to have a communications department, and they were able to come interview some of our survivors and our staff. And from there, we were able to make it into, I think, a 3-minute video, which we were able to share on our social media page and throughout the county. And it just was this great opportunity, especially after the pandemic. Well, obviously, we're still kind of going through it, but with those 2 years, that time frame of not really having an opportunity and an outlet. And so it was just really great to sort of get that back into the community.
Awesome. That sounds like an amazing project. Do you want to? I think that I think one of the things really compelling there is getting it into the gallery. I'm pretty sure if it's the gallery you're talking about, I've been there, and it's a beautiful space, and I think it's really amazing to take folks' art and be able to present that in such like a uplifting way. And I think it's another example. I've noticed like many of these are art-based, and I think that there is a huge benefit to art because it gives you a lot of context without having to write and write or speak and speak for long periods of time. And it also gives people a way to tell their story when they may not be an eloquent writer or a eloquent storyteller, but everybody can make art. Art is for everybody. And then it can be repurposed and put out there digitally in a number of different ways. Does anybody else have anything that they would like to share before moving on?
Ray, did you already read Shannon's example in the chat?
I did, yes.
Okay, perfect.
And I see you're also sharing some more, Eva. What we got here? You shared Empty Place, and you also shared the Bandana Project for Migrant Women. Cool, awesome.
And I know that there's also, there are culturally specific ones, like there's an Indigenous project that includes shawls. And so shawls can be really powerful tools because they represent not just different tribal affiliation, but have special imagery woven into them. And so those are more culturally specific ones that I've seen done.
Yeah, for sure. And as we're talking about these projects, one of the things we are going to be doing by the end of the year is we're going to be putting together a communications toolkit. And in that toolkit, there is going to be a lot of mostly free social resources to be able to put these storytelling elements out into digital spaces. So some of these programs, like they've got websites, fancy galleries and things like that. Part of the toolkit will include tools to be able to put some of this stuff out there on your own, like either basic video editing and hosting, or how to set up like photo galleries using like pre-existing tools that have like social networks and connection capability of their own. So just because you're seeing some of these websites Eva is sharing that may look pretty fancy, that doesn't mean that like that's the only way you can do this kind of work. And speaking of that, we're going to shift now to something a little bit more technical. We're going to start talking some about social media and brand projects and effective ways to communicate to folks. And we're going to start by talking about people and not brands. So y'all have agencies that you work connected to, or that you work as connected to, or you work under directly, and they have social media accounts, and those accounts have reach. However, oftentimes the way to really extend the reach of a program or a message is actually to get it away from the brands and to people. So like this slide says, people are far more likely to listen to their friends, family, or even strangers than to an organization or a company. From a technical point of view, when you're dealing with social media, so when you're talking about like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok accounts, this is especially true on Facebook properties, where there's an entirely different system for what a brand is versus what an individual is. You run into some of these different issues. So when you're talking about a brand account, you actually generally tend to get less reach unless you're spending money. The algorithms on sites like Instagram or Facebook are skewed to show people what their friends are doing, not necessarily what businesses are doing. Brand accounts often have an obvious bias. They have an obvious agenda. So people are less likely to believe what those brands put out there. While individuals talking about the same issues have a sense of authenticity. All this means that brand accounts generally have a limited ability to change people's minds when it comes to what they think about an issue or how they react to it. And they ultimately end up with the ability to make shallow change across a wide berth of people, to hit them quickly and in a very superficial way, while individual accounts tend to have more influence within their personal network, which is a narrower network, but they have the ability to make deeper change. And I think that's something to keep in mind anytime you're doing this work, even if it's something that is coming out that is branded with your agency's name and information and is part of a very obvious campaign. I think that there should always be an element of trying to share that out through individuals, of having volunteers, survivors if they're interested, staff, and other supporters to actually share out and distribute the programs that you're working on. And this is something that most brands and marketing know. That's why brands are working hard to act like people or access influencers. I don't know if y'all are on Twitter or things like that, but Twitter is full of brands like Wendy's, McDonald's, Slim Jim, Duolingo, who are trying to be like edgy and informal and jokey and in a very like way of them attempting to act like people. And they're doing it because they're trying to engage in they're trying to engage like people because they recognize that like classic advertising doesn't work. Just, you know, putting out like slick, polished, you know, slick, polished, and like focus group content doesn't work. So they're all kind of getting a little bit wild. And then on the other hand, you also have, like, if you have an Instagram account that's public, you get messages like this one on the right all the time, where it's somebody who's like, hey, we want you to be a brand ambassador for our clothing or our this or our that. And you see that because you know, people are trying to access, these companies are trying to access what they call influencers, which are people online that have any kind of a following, that are posting publicly around things that connect to their brand. And they're just trying to get people to talk about it. If you ever watch YouTube in the same way, they're always, I watch a lot of YouTube gardening videos, and I watch videos of people that are individuals that are gardening, and they often are stopping to tell me about sponsored like tools or seeds or fertilizer, and they're talking about what they use and where you can get it. And there are all these ways that brands are trying to like dig in and get that access to individual people. And that works the same way with the advocacy work we do. You know, a post or a comment coming from a group with a kind of acronym name is not going to have the same effect as somebody's friend or family member or you know, peer talking about the same issue. So depending on the field you're in, and depending on the comfort of yourself and your volunteers and your survivors, it's good to encourage people to work to post things on their own, on their professional accounts, and to kind of advocate as themselves to the degree which they feel comfortable and safe. Because authenticity is really what moves people, especially in this type of work where there's a lot of taboo, there's a lot of shame, and people just not wanting to talk about issues of sexual violence. Generally, the people that are going to be following your individual's agency's account are already within that line of work, or of doing this kind of work either professionally, or as just somebody who's interested in that kind of advocacy, or they're, you know, a former client or current client or survivor. So reaching out to that greater audience gets more people looking at your actual agency's accounts, as well as also getting your agency's message out to people who really aren't interested in, I think, following like an SV account at all. So we're going to jump over and we're going to talk a bunch about engaging authentically and ethics of storytelling. So this is kind of a collection of everything we've talked about so far and kind of expanding on it. We tell stories to change minds and shift the discussion towards justice. How do we most effectively do that? We take one conversation at a time. again, narrow and deep. You are trying to reach individual people, and sometimes that involves taking the time to reach people one-on-one. I think it's more like this is kind of a false dichotomy, but I think it's better to reach and change the mind of one person with an amount of effort versus like, you know, passively connecting with 100 people and changing nothing. So we're engaging with people as individuals. We're seeking to understand them. We're staying positive even when talking about tough issues. We are remembering when we are communicating online that we have an audience, especially when communicating as an individual. On social media, you're going to encounter trolls. You're going to encounter negative comments, dismissal, outright abuse. And it's important to remember that even if that individual person might be a lost cause, you may be engaging in a conversation that has other people watching and other people watching and other people taking away from the conversation, even if they're not contributing to it. And trolls know this. Trolls know that by shutting you down or by frustrating you, they're also silencing other people. The abuse site dynamic we see in everyday life and relationships also takes place in different forms online. So as we're doing this work, we also make sure that we are practicing self-care first. Nobody should feel obligated to be in situations where they feel uncomfortable or where they feel out of control. You know, I'm going to give y'all as many tools as I can to deal with trolls, to deal with harassment online. But ultimately, it comes down to you engage when you engage, you don't engage when you can't engage. Because if we're not healthy and taking care of ourselves, then we really can't help other people. Roxanne says you can delete comments on social media platforms in case there are trolls. Yes, you absolutely can. Sometimes you may want to, sometimes you may not. I've often left social media comments up because other people are tearing that person apart, or you know, tearing their ideas, their comment apart. So sometimes it's better to show somebody saying something ugly and then other people engaging there, and to show that there are people that are not agreeing with that person's point of view. That's definitely like a situational way of doing things. Like if somebody's threatening people's lives or using slurs or things like that, oftentimes, like, yeah, you want to take that down. Very, very situational, as Desmond says. So the ethics of storytelling. When we're considering sharing the personal stories or work of a survivor, whether a volunteer, client, or staff, there is a serious capacity to do harm and serious ethical considerations. You know, like anything else, like just like in any other context, consent must be given freely and can be taken back for any time and for any reason. So I'm curious with y'all as we get into this conversation around consent, what kind of things do you consider regarding consent and storytelling when you are considering taking a client, a survivor's story, and putting it out in the world? What kind of conversations do you have? What kind of things do you think about? What kind of things do you worry about when you do that? Again, you can come off mute or you can hop into the text chat.
I know for us, when we do our art show on our application, so not only do we have that individual share their legal name, but we also have the option of if they want to use a pseudonym. And so we want them to feel that they have the ability to be anonymous as well when we are sharing any information. And so we also have them sign another form, not only just for whatever name purpose they choose, but if they are going public, like the art show, to be mindful that while we can protect their identity, we can't protect that someone's going to take a picture, you know, of their art, and that from there it might get shared, you know, even further than what they might be thinking of. So we just really want to explore that it sort of leaves our hand at a certain point, and we can protect their identity as much, but we just want them to give as much consent as they can and be aware of the power that they have and what they don't have once we turn things over, if that makes sense.
I think so. It absolutely does. Thank you. Meg.
Thank you. I think something I really like that one of my past colleagues started was, since we're on the community education team, asking counselors who are working with clients who are in a safe place, it's not crisis mode anymore, if they have any survivors who would be comfortable sharing. We didn't want survivors who were in counseling to feel obligated because their counselor was the one asking them. So the counselor, if they have a client who's interested in sharing their story, gives that person, the community education contact point person, a little letter or a little flyer or their contact information about it. And then outside of the counseling session, that survivor can decide if they want to reach out to us directly on their own.
Excuse me, this is the interpreter. My apologies. Could you please slow down a little bit?
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. So just making sure when the client is being asked by a program staff member if they're comfortable or interested in sharing their story, that they can reach out on their own initiative to us, instead of feeling like their counselor is involved in the situation and that power imbalance there.
Excuse me, this is the interpreter. Can you please give me a few seconds to catch up, to finish interpreting?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge point, Meg, the power imbalance that comes with asking somebody for a story and them feeling compelled. I also think, as Cassandra said, that making sure they fully understand the scope of what they can do and like where their story can go. How many times do y'all generally ask and check in with somebody that they want to share a story or a piece of artwork? Is it like you did it once and you signed paperwork and now you're set, or is it something that you revisit? It's kind of an open question to anybody.
So I can share for the projects that we've worked on and collaborated with all of our sexual assault centers across the state, we usually have encouraged some kind of formal release. And the release tends to have a multitude of like options. And so sort of like not just like the standard, do you release your artwork for display, but you know, if we take photographs, for example, we do have a photograph release, and the photograph release will include, do you want to be photographed only from behind? Do you want only your hands photographed? You know, do you want no photographs, maybe just your artwork photographed? And so we try to provide survivors the same way we do through our advocacy, with a plethora of sort of options and choices.
Awesome, thank you for sharing, Eva. I think what you just said there and what you said in the chat about survivors, survivors are often requested by community partners, and one of the concerns I often have are, how do I say it, not to encourage bringing survivors into community in a performative way. They're not a freak show. I think this connects back to, again, this even connects back to like the humanizing element of like the "My Name is Joe" video. It's really easy for people in this work or outside this work to take a survivor, take their story and turn it into a and dehumanize them. And in some ways, like possibly even like re-exploit or victimize them all over again. That's why I have this big highlighted section here that says consent must be freely given and can be taken back at any time for any reason. I worry when working, especially, this isn't a particular attack on comms people, but sometimes communications people are not directly working in the field and may or may not actually have any experience working in the field. So they may think, they sign their releases, we have legal authority to use this wherever we want. Why do we need to go back and check in? Why do we need to double check? While it may be really important because of these issues we've talked about with, okay, this might go further than you think it is. You're going to put this art exhibit up. If somebody takes a picture of it, this is a public art exhibit. If somebody takes a picture and posts it online, you don't have control of what happens with that. If you go and if you agreed to speak with reporters tend to be very dehumanizing in the way that they engage with people. And oftentimes we need to remember that, like, maybe in the moment, sharing a story feels cathartic. I've done work where, because of the logistics of the program, and I've done this within, I've done work within abortion stigma work, where there are people asking people either right before or right after accessing abortion care, are you interested in telling your story? Do you want to write down your story? Do you want to talk to me about your story? And sometimes in the moment, that is a cathartic experience, to be able to have somebody to listen to you, to be able to have your story told. However, this organization always followed up multiple times about the storytelling process with the volunteer before using the story, because we found even if we had signed paperwork that said you can use my story, when they would try to follow up, oftentimes people were no longer interested, because the moment of anxiety, the moment of stress had passed, and now they had processed, and now they were wanting to move past that experience and get on with their life. And we often would end up not using stories that were given to us that were legally authorized, because we weren't able to confirm with people that that is still what they wanted. Eva has some comments in the chat on working with reporters or training reporters on trauma-informed interviewing of survivors and having advocates present. Absolutely. I think it's part of honesty and the ethics of storytelling to tell a survivor when they're going into a situation where things may happen that are unexpected, and to be there to support them in that process. A few things to consider in storytelling consent. We've kind of touched on some of these already. Name or identification is important. Again, somebody said something about using pseudonyms. I don't remember exactly who, but are they willing to use their name and other identifying features? What parts of their name are they willing to use? Maybe they only want to use their first name. Maybe they're happy with their whole name. Maybe they want to remain anonymous or use a synonym. Maybe they want to use their first name and where they're from, like city or state. Excuse me. There are a lot of options there. Do they consent to having photos or videos taken of themselves or the work? Like Eva said, things like, are they interested in just having like no face or no parts of bodies? Like what do they need? Do they need to feel safe and secure and comfortable in the work they're doing? Are they interested in doing interviews or speaking? What elements of that works for them? Are they willing to go full on and interview in front of the press? Or something I've done work around with doing legislative work is, do they want to go and speak in front of the state legislature around, like, say, legislation? Do they want to, or not, are they comfortable in speaking in pre-recorded video where they can do edits and that they can see the final version and be okay with how they're being presented? Are they okay with speaking at friendly events, fundraising events, volunteer events, public rallies? Are they okay with doing in-person or online, or only one or the other? And of course, all of this applies to sharing of anything else. Of any other forms. So Eva says, and all of this doesn't take into consideration the many dual agencies do have policies against advocates speaking to the press. Many of those are DV specific and perhaps can be a conversation with leadership regarding healing needs for our survivors. Absolutely. There may also be.
Excuse me, this is the interpreter.
Oh,
Can you please
sorry.
give me a
Yes,
few
thank
seconds
you.
to catch up? Thank you.
Yes.
Muchos de estos. Ay, sorry. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I think we've probably covered most of this next question already, but I'll give you all a chance. Is there anything else you all ask about before sharing stories, art, or other content from a survivor? Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would want to chime in with?
So one thing that that I do remember having or struggling with that didn't come from a survivor per se, but came from the universities were issues around putting displays up in public spaces where individuals who might be survivors may walk into the space not understanding that some kind of exhibit or display would be present, and how that might trigger survivors who haven't coped or healed from some of their trauma. And I thought it was interesting because the folks who sort of put that in place, or who were kind of concerned about that, were not survivors, and were wanting the display to kind of be placed in a very like hidden part of a library. And, you know, my commentary to them, well, first of all, there wasn't anything particularly upsetting about the display itself. And I said, you know, honestly, the way that a survivor walks through the world is that sometimes they don't even know what's going to trigger their trauma. And so trying to avoid things that are triggering is sort of impossible as a survivor. And so it kind of spoke to that sort of like sensitivity around like content warnings and trigger warnings that have become pretty commonplace across social media. And while I'm not saying that those aren't important, it kind of downplays the way that many survivors face constant triggers on a daily basis and don't get a say, you know, in whether they're triggered or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one of the things that kind of came up with that question for me is, you know, like how can we, instead of like saying, no, let's not do this at all, providing some kind of solution focused way of, you know, coming to terms with like, this is a reality. And when you want to kind of hide it away, that contributes to the ways that survivor stories are hidden away. And I'm not sure if that's making sense, but instead of, for example, putting the display out of sight, maybe having a sign in front of the venue that says we are currently exhibiting, you know, this display, and it's in this particular location. So basically giving that person the option to not, you know, enter that space if it is something that might be upsetting to them.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. I jotted down a note. I do actually want to come back to that later when we talk about white supremacy culture. Because I think it applies there very much, like hiding what's making, not necessarily in the paternalist way of trying to protect survivors, you're actually hiding the content that survivors are familiar with from people who may not be survivors and just feel uncomfortable about it. So who are we really protecting? Thanks so much for sharing that, Eva. Next, I wanted to talk briefly about revision process for storytelling. This can be video. This is mostly for video and like text. Oftentimes survivors may have limited or no writing ability. So consider the possibility of doing a transcription of a verbal telling of a story, or doing something in like an interview format, or transcribing their story and editing it and then like reading it back to them so that they can approve it. When you're editing, you want to have a story that is readable and understandable. You want to limit typos so that you're not embarrassing the victim that's trying to tell their story. We have a lot of embedded, again, we're going to get into it, white supremacy culture, but a lot of times we're like a story that may be written in slang or simple language, or maybe written by somebody who's not English as a first language speaker, where people can focus on the problems with that person's language and their writing rather than hearing the actual story. You may also want to edit out if there is problematic language within the story. This would mean, like, you know, them making statements that maybe are internalized sexism or racism, or overt sexism or racism, and going back to them and being like, this is not okay. We need to tweak this, or we need to remove this point. Maybe you used to turn a phrase that you don't realize is problematic, both so that you're not putting that out there where they're going to be attacked by people again publicly, or you know, you're not implying that your agency supports something like that. And of course, lastly, we don't want to over refine the survivor or volunteer's story. We want to, of course, make it accurate, you know, remove any typos, but we don't want to polish it to the point where it no longer sounds like an authentic story. I wanted to share really quickly some of the places that you can share these stories online. Some of the earlier examples I showed you, some of them were on like really nice, fancy, dedicated websites. They obviously have communications people, website designers, and things like that. And a lot of times in your project, you're just not going to have that capability. So these are some tools that you can use instead of you know, building that stuff out. If you're doing written stories or videos, you have blog platforms like Medium, which has social media and following elements involved, as well as like WordPress.com. For video, you of course have sites like, you know, YouTube is always the biggest one. For photo galleries, like for art exhibits and things like that, you can always go with something pretty simple like Flickr, which is a great platform for sharing photos and is still free. And of course, all of your other social media platforms are available to you as well, to be able to share your content out and take something that may be a physical exhibit, an in-person art exhibit, an in-person space, and turn it into something that can have a digital element and a digital reach. So now, speaking of digital sharing, we're going to now shift feet a little bit, and we're going to start talking about social media, the internet, and doing work on digital platforms that are open to the public. and maybe might not be as protected. The internet can be a terrible place, simple as that. You know, and we're going to center in this on a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a queer Black writer and activist. She says, "Your no makes the way for your yes. Boundaries create the container within which your yes is authentic. Being able to say no makes yes a choice." So we're going to talk about all the things you're going to encounter that you may want to say no to. And it's okay to say no to those things. And sometimes it's also okay to say yes to engaging in, you know, what might be people being toxic or abusive. And we'll go into that a little bit more. When you're working online, you will encounter abusive behavior, straight, period. You never have to engage in harmful situations online, and what is harmful is entirely up to you, entirely up to each individual advocate. But I find personally that it really helps to give names to the things that we're experiencing and to be able to talk about them and understand them. So with that, here's a little bit of what to expect as far as trolling behavior you're going to find when engaging on digital platforms. These are broken down. These are based off of an article that is linked right here at the bottom of this page around the different types of trolls you meet online. I have tweaked it a little bit from my own experience, but it's relatively the same. You have purity testers. These are people that are going to argue that whatever position you have is invalid if it's not pure, or that your position is invalid if you yourself are not pure. A common one for this is if somebody is critical of, say, capitalism. Somebody might say, well, it's funny that you don't like capitalism, but you have a job, you make money. You know, so that's that idea. Willful misinterpreters are people who take your argument and intentionally interpret it as something more than it is, something more extreme than it is, or otherwise just take what you're like. They argue back in bad faith. Straw man arguments are people who are straw man architects who make straw man arguments, are those people who they argue about a perceived idea of who you are and not what you're actually saying. These are the folks that like rail against feminists instead of talking about the actual policy or issue that you're talking about. You have homework assigners. These are people that make wild claims, and then when you ask for proof, tell you that like Google is free or you can look it up. Haphazard posters are people who tend to post pretty wild or incoherent stuff or send you lots of links, or anything or other things like that. They often you know, they can sometimes be confused, or it might even be people who are in need of help or support if they seem really erratic. You know, it's often a sign of trauma or misunderstanding or intense fear, or it can just be somebody who communicates that way. Enlightened cynics are those who think no solution is going to solve our problem because everything is terrible. So every side is wrong. Both sides are equally at harm, regardless of the issue. And it's usually a way that people just try to feel like they're superior or feel like they have control without actually taking sides on anything. Whataboutists are folks who will take really extreme edge cases and use them to argue against the main premise of what you're talking about. A good example that comes to mind right now is people who argue against the welfare state or like any kind of support of needy people based off of individual bad actors who have committed fraud or things like that. Logic destroyers are people who you know, they watch a little bit too much misogynistic content on YouTube. And they think that like they're just like debating and they're the smartest of the smart, and everything to them is kind of just like a game. And they're really frustrating and can be really horrible to try to communicate with, because they often view what for a survivor might be is definitely like real trauma, real lived experience. You know, they engage with as like a thought experiment, as like a fun competition. And finally, you have jackers, also known as sea lions, which are those that are just asking questions. These are folks that will often continue to engage in an argument even after you've set a boundary, because they feel like they have the right to debate you until the end of time. They are also hard to deal with because they often, like I said, they boundary push or boundary like trample, feeling that it doesn't matter what you say, that you should be able to, that they should be able to continue the debate until they're satisfied, and they will probably never be satisfied. Baiting and doxing are tactics that are used in combination with all of they're not trolling styles, but they're things that are used to harass people online. Baiting is when a troll tries to get you to say something that they feel is extreme in or out of context, that they then use as justification for their own cause. This could be in the individual argument or in a broader scale. In a broader scale, it can be connected with doxing. Doxing is digging up and publishing private information for the purposes of harassment. This can go from the most benign, which is, say, taking a comment made in a private chat and publishing it publicly, getting you online harassment on that platform, to actually digging up individual pieces of information like address, phone number, you know, other social media other social media platforms, information, email addresses, and things like that. And if they combine baiting, if they combine information, getting you to say something extreme with doxing, what often happens is that leads to people being, you know, directly contacting somebody, maybe harassing phone calls or things like that. There are a number of ways to deal with doxing, as far as like internet security, being very careful about the information you put out there, working under pseudonyms on social media, or another option is just to be relatively open around your information. Doxing is not nearly as effective if you're not as worried about people having basic information. However, if people do decide to harass you, people are going to decide to harass you. And these are the type of things, all of this information to share and think about, both when you're advocating and when you are talking with survivors that you work with about them being advocates as well. I feel like there is a really ethical imperative to talk to your folks about this, because they really need to, not to scare them, but so they have a good idea of like what they can encounter. So all of these tactics, all of these types of trolls, all of this pushback that you're going to get is often very much rooted in white supremacy culture. You will face opposition for your ideas, rooted in white supremacy culture. I'm going to read this quote here. This is from Tima Okun, who is a white woman, who is the person who came up with this structure in combination with Kenneth Jackson Jones, who is a Black professor. And she says, white supremacy culture is inextricably linked to all the other oppressions: capitalism, sexism, class and gender oppression, ableism, ageism, Christian hegemony. These and more are all interconnected and intersected and stirred together in a toxic brew that is reflected in our devastation of the air and water and land and living beings we have and are destroying and disregarding in the name of profit and power. So we talk about white supremacy culture, we talk about white supremacy, but this includes all of our other isms. White supremacy culture could also be called, colonialism. Very, very closely linked. And, you can talk about which of these isms is the top ism and which ones derive from others, but it's, I think that all of them seem to connect to white supremacy culture. And this model, however not perfect, does pretty well at understanding the basics of some of this stuff. So these are the traits of white supremacy culture. These are the values that white supremacy culture holds and the defense mechanisms that people and institutions who benefit from white supremacy culture use to defend the system and defend their own power within it. Those are, and if you go, there was a link on the last page and there's a link on this page, which have been shared in the chat, that give you more information on this. And this particular uuare.org link goes pretty in depth and gives bulleted lists under each of these individual traits. But I'm going to go through them briefly and give you a general idea of what they are. We begin with perfectionism. Perfectionism is the idea that if you are not perfect, you don't count. If you don't execute something flawlessly, then that thing can be discarded or disregarded. Sense of urgency, the idea that everything has to be done now, that everything has to be done quickly, that there's never any time to wait. It's often used to shut down discussion. Defensiveness, this is also white fragility. The idea that when an idea is challenged, you have a quick response to be defensive, to make what might be a critique of a system or a choice into an attack on an individual, or on some greater value. Obviously, this is a big one used to shut down, again, any defenses, any kind of attacks or critiques made upon our current inequality. Quantity over quality, simply the idea that bigger numbers are better, more like bigger numbers look better, they're more impressive, and they are more important than less things done better. Worship of the written word. This is the tendency of this social structure to emphasize written rules, laws, to attempt to document and create manuals for everything. If any of y'all work within the legal system and advocate within the legal system, you are of course constantly encountering this, where our legal system works where following the rules of the legal system is more important than justice in some cases. Barriers of court proceedings can often lead to a barrier to justice. Only one right way, the idea that there is only one right way to do things, and that other ways are going to be more flawed. There's also the assumption that the only one right way is the way we are doing things now. And if you want to do something different, then you are often immature or naive, which is paternalism. And as you can see, these are connected together, and you're also starting to kind of see some redundancy here. So only one right way is pretty similar to something. It's like you can see how it connects to something like defensiveness. Like, well, this is the only way we can do it. So if my way is wrong, then if your way is better, then my way is wrong and I'm wrong. You also see like weird contradictions start to come out where, things need to be perfect, but there's only one right way, even if that right way is flawed. And now we're talking about now we're kind of connecting into things like either or thinking, where you either have to have one thing or another. The inability to hold complexity, the inability to hold multiple truths being being real at the same time. One group must win, one culture must be better, this plan or that plan. Power hoarding. The people who have power want to keep power. This is often seen as benevolent, as paternalism. I have power because I'm good, and you don't have power because you can't handle the power. So, you know, it's best to just leave things to me. Also, I don't want to give up my power for fear that other people gaining power will treat me in the same way that I currently treat people without power. Next, we have fear of open conflict, which connects into defensiveness, not defensivism, defensiveness. This is a huge one. This and defensiveness really hold up the core of the system and are what you often see when any aspect of white supremacy culture is challenged. Individualism, just like there's only one right way, you are, you know, each individual should be finding their own right way, should be doing what should be making changes on their own. If you struggle, if you have deficiency, it's on you. It's not a systemic thing, it's all a you thing. This also ties into ideas like paternalism and perfectionism and even defensiveness and power hoarding. I'm the only one is very much a combination of individualism, paternalism, and only one right way. I'm the only one that can do this. You know, this is a common thing I think many of us that are motivated struggle with, many of us that are seen as A-type personalities. This idea that like, I could do this, but I need to get it done right now, and it's easier for me to just do it. And that I need to get it done right now is also an element of sense of urgency. Progress is bigger or more. This is tying the idea of progress to quantity, tying the idea of progress into more. You know, like society is better if we have more things. Society is better if we have more food. Never mind the quality of that food or the quality of those objects, but having more is what's important. Objectivity. This is one of those hills I will die on. I think that objectivity is not a real thing. I don't think there is much in this world that is objective. Everything has a degree of subjectivity to it. Objectivity often means the point of view of the people with power, which is usually cis white men. This is really obvious if you look into, say, things like history and anthropology, where European supremacy is often assumed until proven otherwise, and that takes very much work to do. And finally, we have right to comfort, which is similar to fear of open conflict and defensiveness, and even some perfectionism. The idea that the people in the system who are usually the idea that people in the system that are running the system or who benefit, not really running, but benefit from the system are have the right to be comfortable. You see this happen in, like, you know, the fear of open conflict, the avoidance of open conflict, the adherence of decorum, the idea that you may have a valid point, but you're not saying it right and you're going to upset people. And that being like very much an argument for not having that conflict, for not engaging in constructive conflict. Looking at the chat right now, Meg says this is very helpful. They didn't realize they would recognize so many of these, and it's always helpful to put a name on a harmful behavior and define things more clearly. And Evan notes that abusive folks do this all the time, talking about the trolling methods, and absolutely, like all of this, you can see the trolling methods, and even some of this, you can see this stuff play out in the same way when you talk about abusive relationships, whether at work or in relationships or anywhere else. So real quick, I wanted to actually tie some of these back to a couple of examples that were made. First off, yes, Meg earlier talked about the example of the survivor who went on to run a marathon, and I didn't want to like call her out, but I do think that this is a great example of a way that showing stories or specifically focusing on extreme success stories can actually be disencouraging of other folks that might have a more mundane story, like, oh, I survived the assault and I didn't go run marathons. I'm just happy to be able to keep a job and not cry every night. That is a success too. And I think it's important to tell all of those type of stories and recognize that no matter what we're doing, we're engaging in some of these things. And sometimes with your audience, you have to engage with these things. Like if you're talking with donors, like these donors are people that benefit from white supremacy culture. They have money, they have privilege. Many of them are white. If they're not, they probably have internalized some of these ideas, because none of these ideas are things that like people of color aren't capable of buying into as well. They often do. We all do. Like this is the water we swim in. But just to think for a second, that story, what does that fall into? Falls into a little bit of like progress is bigger and more. This is somebody who persevered and became amazing. It's one exceptional individual, which is individualism. There's a sense of perfectionism, like this person is held up as an amazing case because they achieved to an amazing level, and somebody who is not achieving to that level, an example like this can be used to push them down or discourage them or invalidate their experience. I also want to bring up the story Eva told about the art exhibit and struggling with people wanting to, who control the space, wanting to put the survivor art exhibit into a hidden away space, into a space somewhere in the back where it wouldn't be seen. And I think in this case, like, there's definitely a huge, absolutely, Eva, there's a huge right to comfort there. The right of that person who may or may not be a survivor, or other people being comfortable, not having to worry about being uncomfortable by seeing like a painful or a difficult exhibit. There's also like, I think, paternalism in the same way, like that person thinking that they know what other people need. I think are a few things right there. Fear of open conflict. Perhaps this person who runs this space does not want to have to deal with people coming in and becoming upset. These are other, so like you can very much like kind of tie back what you're thinking to these ideas. And for me, this really helps as a framework within advocacy space, especially when it's more confrontational advocacy space, where you're pushing for one thing and somebody else is kind of pushing back. This list can be really beneficial. Lastly, I want to talk quickly about parroting talking points. So a lot of these trolls and a lot of white people coming from this white supremacist mindset are going to use really bad rhetoric. So how do we refute rhetoric that distorts issues that we care about without spreading that rhetoric? And is that even a concern? I believe, and what I've seen with the work that I do, is that there is we don't want to worry so much about promoting that rhetoric, but we definitely want to be challenging it, and we want to challenge the framing, not argue within the framing. And I think that's something that I see lots of people that want to argue, that want to debate authentically, end up doing. Somebody makes a claim, and then in bad faith, and then the person arguing proceeds to then argue within the context of that framing instead of just rejecting it. So like, for example, somebody might say, make an argument like, Eva is suggesting the idea that women lie about sexual assault. And then you may end up bogged down in an argument, claiming individual particular cases or individual situations or celebrities or anything like that. When really what the best thing to do is probably to say, statistically, very few cases end up being false reports. Most women are not equivalent to celebrities and don't have the power and the influence or even like just the mindset to do something like that, and then move on. And if somebody keeps bringing it up, be like, this is not a real framing. You could also you know, make some other things, or you can also make similar arguments around things like around issues like, you know, the idea that like men are underreported in sexual assault, for instance, like they are, but also like that's also just another like kind of false, like let's shift the argument over here. I think a lot of people feel often like it is rude to not address somebody's ridiculous claims, and I think that they should be addressed, even if they're addressed to refute and dismiss and then go back to the point you're trying to make. So that's kind of like where I feel like you should go there. I know some of you may be in argumentative spaces, some of you may not, but oftentimes this comes up, and for the people who feel comfortable, I want y'all to have the tools to be able to actually have those talks, because as I've mentioned before, oftentimes when you're having this debate, you may not be convincing the other person, but there are always a handful of people quietly reading that thread, quietly reading that debate, and what they see there can make a difference. And that could be the difference between somebody walking away and saying like, yeah, women do lie about sexual assault, or somebody seeing your reply and being like, oh, that's not a real narrative, that's not a real thing, that's something you see on TV, that's something you see in celebrity news, but it's very rare with like regular people and statistically. So yeah, I'm going to skip since we are out of time. These are all extra information. I'm going to leave you with one final quote. I love this quote. I grew up with Mr. Rogers. And he definitely helped shape my ideas of what it means to support people and care for people. And this is a really great quote I love from him that I want to end off with. He says, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And everybody here, all y'all on this call, you are the helpers. You are the people that when everybody else is running away or running towards, when everybody else is quietly shuffling past, you are the ones that go and talk and help and see people in need and do your best to take care of them. So I appreciate being able to have this, do this training, have these conversations with you today. I look forward to talking to you again. This is my contact information. You can send me an email. You can find me on Instagram. I'm not really on Twitter anymore. I got to remove that icon. But you can reach out. You can also reach out to Eva and get my information through them. And I have really enjoyed this time. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.